It was another Monday morning. The sign on the door said private investigator, but the sign below that said closed, and I was saying yes to a third cup of coffee. It was cold and bitter, like a C++ programmer at a Rust conference. My partner was out of town looking into a counterfeit fashions case, but that was like bad security metrics, a lot of questionable value and misleading labels. I stared at a March Madness bracket, thinking AppSec could use a tournament of its own to eliminate poor advice. I thought about this some more as I walked down to my local donut shop to use their public Wi-Fi, where I checked my email and scanned a QR code to see their menu. In the last 20 years, donuts had become twice as expensive and AppSec advice about half as useful. After all, I had a patched device, HSTS, and WebAuthn. Which means this week we chat with Lebin Cheng from Imperva about the state of API security and what it takes to protect a modern endpoint. In the news segment, auth bypass against TeamCity, art prompt attacks against LLMs, handling low-quality vuln reports, secure by design that removes dependencies, and more. Grab a donut and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
This is episode 276, recorded March 11th, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Good morning. I'm happy to be on this week's edition of Job Security Weekly.
Job Security Weekly, that's right. We're going to be here for like 2076 or something. We also have Akira Brand because there's that much security going on. Hello, Akira.
Hi, I'm happy to be here and bolster our security efforts.
We're bolstering away. Another way you could bolster your security efforts, Akira, and listeners, is by saving $100 on your RSA Conference 2024 full conference pass. RSA Conference will take place May 6th through 9th in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC24 and use the code 54USECweekly. We hope to see you there. And now for our sponsored interview. Lebin Cheng is a technologist and serial entrepreneur with more than 20 years of experience in cybersecurity. Cheng co-founded Netskope and later co-founded Cloud Vector, which was acquired by Imperva. He has been awarded 15 patents in areas such as network security, application infrastructure, and API inspection. Hello, Lebin. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. Hello, Mike, and hello, John.
Well, it's been, I think, almost exactly 2 years since you last joined us talking about API security. And unfortunately, can I be optimistic? Has the state of API security improved? Are we done? Can we go home now?
No, unfortunately not. But actually, it's good for me because there's more API security problem and it's a job guarantee. Yep.
Well, as John said, we've got some job security here in AppSec. But let's talk about what that job security really entails. I'm curious about what are some of the common modern API abuses that you're seeing right now? How are these APIs being attacked?
Yeah, so about 2 years ago, as you point out, that when we talk and we are advocating, we're actually seeing the trend. We're seeing, API being used and being widely used, and in the almost a lifetime, in AppSec, right? 2 years has passed, and API adoption is extremely widespread, as you point out earlier in the introduction to this. You said you scan a QR code and order from the menu. And actually what's happening is your mobile device actually making API call to the backend. And the backends, more often than not, is actually making API call again to another backend, right? Front end to backend. And it's all connected by API. And one thing that we see is actually that the trend continue. And we are seeing, in our most recent API report, we see majority of enterprise, the calls, the web calls are API calls. More than sometimes you have figures like 70%, 80%, but we haven't seen actually it ever dip below 70%, below 3/4. So with the rise of APIs, we are actually seeing, as we feared 2 years ago when we talked about, as APIs started, API threat will continue to predominantly being used as a way for bad actors to try to get to the data, actually the crown jewel, right? Just like you rob the bank to get to the money, to get to people's data. And we're actually seeing a uptick of automated attacks, and not only just automated attacks, just spreading and trying to try the kind of brute force attack, but actually automated attack purpose-built to target specific API and target business logic. So that's one thing that we are seeing is happening. And in terms of overall, the threat landscape is changing to more specific, more sophisticated, but targeted attacks.
And that's, I wanted to talk about some of that targeting to help. And part of the reason to talk about how are these attacked is for developers, AppSec teams to think about threat models.
Yes.
Consider, have we included how our APIs are really being abused into our defensive thinking? And looking at your state of security report, one of the nice things I liked seeing was that cross-site scripting and SQL injection were actually pretty low at the bottom. And even SSRF was pretty low at the bottom in terms of volume of attacks, types of attacks. And this business logic was pretty high. So tell us a little bit more about this, the types of business logic or what this looks like. Because, and part of the reason I'm asking is that lots of business logic doesn't have garbage data that's coming through. It looks like valid requests, right?
Exactly. And one thing that I want to clarify is, as you point out, in the report, it looks like cross-site scripting and those are lower in volume because we measure those after the cloud web already have a chance to filter them out. So it was and those attacks still, if you look at the Wild West, completely open, there's still a lot of them going, but many of them just fail to go through a very good cloud web, standard web application firewall, etc. Right? But then once you have those in place, whatever gets sneaked through the tracking, the block, it was those kind of business logic attacks. And business logic attacks target business logic, right? And that's why they're API specific, they're application specific. And a few examples include, one simple example is if somebody use a bot to scan the API endpoints and trying to find, for example, unauthenticated APIs, or trying to find API that has a shared API token. We call it not unauthenticated API, but under authenticated API, right? Just like in the old days, when password discipline is not very strong, people have admin password everywhere, and you look for admin password. And a API token that is generated once for convenience and embedded in all client programs, they are the kind of shared API token, and we see some of those as well. And that's targeting business logic, right? That's example of business logic, because business logic means your API implement the business workflow, and under authentication, unauthentication is business logic. For example, another one is shadow API, deprecated API, because API evolve as application evolve, and sometimes some API are left for backward compatibility reason, but you forgot to retire them, you forgot to remove them from the endpoints, and they continue to be in place. And sometimes those shadow API are being abused. And actually, another example could be the object level authorization failure or the lack of such. And where I could log in as Lebin, but somehow I get to my data. And those are actually the most sophisticated part. Unfortunately, what we are seeing a lot of lower hanging fruit for the bad actors still are deprecated API that does not retire, or unauthenticated or under authenticated APIs.
Lebin, what you were describing there is, that aspect of business logic. What does the application do? In other words, is this an endpoint that validates credit card numbers? And if it's under authenticated or even unauthenticated, that's a great way for bots and criminals, we'll call them, just to say here, I have a list of potentially valid credit cards. Which of them are useful that they can reuse, resell, et cetera, to use for fraud? You also started to talk about shadow endpoints and deprecated endpoints. And this gets me thinking again about classic problem of asset inventory, API inventory. So tell us a little bit, before we talk about just the shadow and deprecated parts, What's the volume that you've seen of just endpoints or the size of APIs that developers are dealing with? Give us a sense of the complexity of what it takes to have a single API endpoint for that scanning that QR code, like you mentioned, that fans out into potentially a bunch of different services.
Yeah, so we just released our report, and I welcome anybody who or interested and download the report from Imperva. And the report is actually generated from we have some empirical data from what we see because we operate one of the biggest cloud apps in the cloud, right? So we look at all the traffics and even customer who has not subscribed to our APIs, we kind of observe the traffic and see what if we have API security turns on, and this is what we can find. And we found an average about 600 APIs endpoints among all those kind of mid-sized enterprise, reasonable size enterprise that we take data from. And among those 600, we see about 20 also deprecated API on average. Now, sometimes they get deprecated after a long while. So you see this running average about 20 also. And that's enough of a concern because another extra data point that may not reflected in the report was that we look at thousands of customers and we actually had not found too many, almost like you can count with single hand, the finger in your single hands is of about the number of customers who has no shadow or duplicate APIs lying around. Almost everybody have a little, and average is about 20. And it is a good number of API that is somehow kind of deprecated, never used, and but still lying there for a while. And that I attribute it to maybe the nature of API making it worse than, for example, let's say you have a website and you have some web pages and you retire them and actually there's no reason for them to lie around. API is an application interface, and sometimes you still have some old clients. So when you evolve your APIs, sometimes for backward compatibility, there's a small percentage of your clients still using the API in the old way, and sometimes it makes you have to leave some API around, some old version of them, and that actually may contribute to the reason why so many enterprise has some old stuff lying around.
That's always a good development challenge too, because sometimes in APIs when it's like business to business or supporting mobile devices that maybe want to there can be a contract there that we do need to support an ancient device or something like that. So there's often a reason for that, they're deprecated, but they have to stick around. Have you seen developers approach the security of those in any different way? Or do you have advice for how to make sure those deprecated don't just become completely dusty and forgotten, or lack, the better security, I will say, and without details of more modern endpoints?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I just come across one customer, and they actually look for our advice as to how to deal with it. Was that they have a API, and one of like the thousand API need to stay around just because one of the very important partner they cannot get rid of is running some endpoints that they cannot upgrade. And I have this one enterprise partners, and they need this API. And we found actually this API, the way it operates, have vulnerability. So they move on. They actually change the design. They say, what can we do about that? And one thing that we can advise is because this API lie around just because of one endpoint, right? So we can help them. Maybe you can turn on the monitoring and just limit the access to that endpoint, maybe to just one partner, right? Source IP or what have you, or one kind of access token. And that limit your exposure. The one that most dangerous actually was that you have some API and you leave a couple of those shadow API behind, but you forgot to turn on restrictions onto the access to them. So actually, if you have some old API you have to leave behind, maybe consider the use case that drive the older API and turn on some access control and limit your exposure. Right? If you have to leave them behind, but at least keep the client access to them to a minimum, minimize their exposure, basically.
Go ahead, Akira.
Lebin, I have a question for you.
Yes.
In a perfect world,
Mm-hmm.
all APIs would be secure by design, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would have time to threat model everything. We would have time to talk to the developers and the software architects and everyone else related to that. What do you do to fold in secure by design as the APIs are being developed, or maybe they are deprecated or something along those lines? Like, how do you envision that concept fitting into the SDLC, maybe when it's a little bit too late, as it were?
Yeah, so the SDLC and API secure by design, it is a great hope, but sometimes security, as many security professionals has pointed out, right? They have a smaller team and they actually are competing with the business imperative, right? APIs are there, APIs are changing very rapidly because people use API for cloud migrations, to enable important business workflows, right? And the business workflow also changed. So sometimes what we are seeing is not a problem of the security folks, even CIOs, CISOs or CTOs, they all recognize the importance of security. But at the same time, you cannot just say, with only a few exceptions, sometimes the security team has to say we have to just settle with good enough, right? For example, you have sometimes API need to change. Some organization adopt rapid development practices, and their API may change on a monthly or weekly basis. And even if you have full review, a week later, then and then also coupled with the severe lack of security professionals, right? The security team is always a small team. Then how can you catch up with hundreds of APIs, 100 API endpoints, and many of them are changing on a weekly basis? Then there's a lack of manpower, and there's not a lack of view and not a lack of desire. So rather than recommending kind of the best of breed API by design, we try to turn the table a little bit around and see if we can offer some tools and at least to automate the monitoring, for us to discover, for us to risk assess, almost like automate and have the security camera turned on, so that without human inspection, you find out some bad behavior or some bad design. And to your point, we have some customer now starting to mature into, okay, we see so many APIs vulnerabilities make it into runtime. Can we actually go back and learn from our runtime monitoring and improve our API security testing? So actually, there's a new area where a lot of customers are maturing into help me conduct more sophisticated API security testing and test the API and make sure we discover and remove bugs that make into production before you make into production. So that actually maybe I hope that answers your question about it's not like just review, code review and all that, because that's too time consuming. Use some tools, test and monitor, and then maybe that have the security team stand a chance to catch up with the evolution of APIs and application in general.
Yeah, and even
Beautiful,
things like
thank you.
code reviews, those are hard. Those are easy ways to burn people out. They don't scale either,
Exactly.
especially if you're relying on humans. I'm curious from that developer perspective to still continue kind of the theme of Akira's question. I want to think that modern API development has things like an API gateway. You have lambdas that you're spinning up. Even like if you're doing it within a cloud environment, you could have infrastructure as code, IAC, that helps with these ideas of at least what do I have, the inventory, as well as APIs being documented. Are there certain ways that you've seen teams be more successful, more mature because they've used certain types of just development primitives or development components versus just that sprawl or something? I'm kind of curious if you've seen something that tamps down that emergence of shadow APIs or just forgotten and unknown APIs.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, if there's any not all bad news and any kind of glimmer of hope is that over the years and since we last talked, we actually see developers are maturing and they are a lot more willing to work with security teams. It used to, we talk to them, development teams say, hey, I have an API gateway, we block off all the bad attacks, and we're done. And now, actually we have a lot more customers very curious and see how we can automate the process. And we are seeing actually developers starting to, pay attention to better inventory of the APIs. And so actually, we're almost there saying that the discovery process and all that is getting the result that we want. However, because the security awareness from developers even increasing, it actually make the kind of the low hanging fruit attacks much harder to carry out. So, as you point out, a lot of the development team, before they push the API to the production, they adopt an API gateway. They make sure the inventory, the known APIs, and they make sure they have a web application firewall to fend off some of the injection attacks and things like that. But then that pushed the bad actor to look for another way to get in. And then almost like it's an arm race, right? And then with the good news of developers being more security aware and more APIs are kind of secure by design, and we're actually seeing a lot of developers being more careful about validating inputs, right? For bad inputs, for special characters, there's very few mistakes that is left there. That is for the known attacks. However, as at the beginning of this talk, we talk about some of the more business logic attacks, sophisticated attacks, abuse looks exactly like legitimate requests, and we are seeing an increase of that. And because those kind of abuse and attack tend to be more successful now, because the bar has been raised with the developer working more closely with security.
Yeah, I think part of there's to touch on that testing part too, because that's a lot of the area where developers are just testing their code, functional testing, et cetera, is very easy. I want to say in principle to imagine, we're just testing for input, input validation, common characters, rejecting garbage characters, those types of things. But the functional testing or the use case testing for this business logic, that seems a little bit harder to implement. It takes more time. I think it takes more time for developers to do, because you have to often build up state. Building state across APIs can be kind of tough too. And it's a huge challenge for automated scanners. So where have you seen any, testing frameworks that make that easier for developers to be able to say, we just have some better business logic enforcement now, rather than just that input validation level?
Yeah, that's extremely good points and great questions. And I'm seeing this as a new area that is in the past. Actually we help customers discover the API, and then we run some fuzzing logic based on the discovery result, and that's actually relatively easy to automate, right? And as you point out, but business logic is different from API to API. It's almost impossible to automate. You cannot just take a tool that works for somebody else's application and then try to apply to your application. So there's a new area of interest and investment. I'm starting to hear from our customer, and they're giving us input. I unfortunately, I don't think that is mature enough in this overall field that there's a widely accepted framework. Actually, there's a couple of startups starting to come up and with very innovative idea, and we have a few ideas that in the work as well ourselves. And but in general, the general area where we are moving into is kind of combine. I hate to say, we use AI, because that's almost the answer to everything security nowadays.
Exactly.
we try to kind of get enough data, but not enough data in terms of LLM and all that. But we actually look at gather enough data to track the behavior of the application itself, which is application specific or even specific version of the application. And then we use that behavior and try to tweak that based on some known patterns. For one example, to find out if an API is under-authenticated. We can track the API being used. We maybe collect some of the tokens and with the permission of the customer, we can try to use that token, try to make some other calls maybe in the later days or different session and see if that goes through, right? So that's a very simple example of tweaking the flow of the logic. But you cannot do that with a simple fuzzing tool because the simple fuzzing tool is too simplistic because different API have different way to authenticate, different keys, right? You have to almost like link real-time monitoring and capture and inspection with test generation, and then you test almost near real time. And that's actually in general where we're moving into. Yeah.
And part of that brings up that that challenge, that trade-off between improving the ability for a scanner, a fuzzer to interact and with the API and exercise some of the workflows rather than just a single endpoint. Here's a chain of endpoints in order to accomplish something, which is exactly what a bad bot is trying to do, right?
Exactly.
Whether it's that validate credit cards, be the first in line to purchase tickets to the Taylor Swift concert. These are great ways of API abuse that have nothing to do with cross-site scripting, SQL injection, or other garbage input. So you can't put a human CAPTCHA on an API endpoint, and I'll argue you shouldn't be putting those CAPTCHAs on human facing sites anyway because they're annoying. But have you seen ways that organizations have countered bots kind of from the developer's perspective, meaning design approaches that they've done within the application itself versus having something like the API gateway or some, an external third-party solution even in front of their API itself?
Yeah, actually, we are seeing a increasing interest from customer, actually including customer who are traditionally using the bot protection, solutions. So bot and API is kind of merging together, because APIs are meant for a bot, right? Meant for the automated client. So it's impossible for you to try to just differentiate a human interaction versus a bot interaction. It's all automated interaction. That makes API becoming that kind of the most attractive endpoints for bot to try to explore. Another reason that I see a lot of bots are starting to kind of hit on API endpoints are that in order for a bad actors to find out vulnerability about APIs, because a bad actor cannot simply just replay some attacks. It's kind of like injection attack, right? Because you can just try your luck with any API endpoint, you just try the injection attack. But for business logic abuse, you have to find the specific way to get into that application first. So even for the bad actor has to kind of automate, because it cannot scale for him or herself as a bad actor to try to find the automation. So the automation is bad bots. So it's almost like arms race. We're seeing bad bots behaving like a sophisticated API vulnerability scanner. It's almost like an arms race going on. So we are actually seeing some customers starting to look for ways to kind of have a different ways to prevent bad bot, abuse of the APIs. For example, you generate one-time tokens that cannot be reused on a session, and you kind of shorten the API sessions. Simple things like that will go a long way to preventing a bot from trying to abuse an API endpoint.
I think it's actually a little worse than that, Lebin. We've covered groups on here that have better understanding of their business logic or their SDLC or their design by secure design than some of not just your customers but like everyone in the world. So how does someone keep up with that?
You mean keep up with the bad bots and abusing the APIs?
I mean, it's not so much the bad bot. It's the group that's creating that bad bot, right? That they're realizing there's a lot of money in this to be made. So is it something as simple as excuse me, I don't want to say something. Well, I hope it's as simple as go behind an API gateway or use a particular scanner. Like, is there some sort of larger overall scheme that we should be thinking about? Like, how do we stay ahead of these guys?
Yeah, so in this particular topics, I'm a little bit pessimistic because no matter how you do it, it's almost like arms race, and because the the reward for the bad actor is so great, right? All you need to look at some of the major API outbreak, that break, some of the major, telecoms provider in Australia and things like that. You get millions and millions of records, by automation. Once you find just a single API endpoint that's vulnerable, right? And so that's why, and API gateways and all that, they are general tools, right? No matter how you customize it, it's still general purpose tools, and extremely hard for one application owner to try to kind of tell the tool the desired behavior of the API. Sometimes even the developers who are still there, they cannot describe the complete desired behavioral profile. So rather than just hoping that you have an API that have no flaw, maybe be a little bit pessimistic and say, assuming something somebody determined may get in. So the second step is almost like detection and response. And something like you have a security camera. In the worst case, for example, when somebody get in and steal 10 records, and maybe you can stop at 10 records, and rather than the millions of records. And actually, I cannot name names, but one CISO actually say this in the right way. He said, "Well, if you can immediately tell me if I have vulnerabilities, and somebody steal 10 records, I can deal with it. I can respond, I can block, and I can apologize to the 10 customer. But if it raised to a certain threshold, 1,000 or 1,000,000, my name will be on the newspaper, then, all are lost. So if you have a tool that can, in the worst case, start at 10 or maybe 15, that's still a progress. So that's something that we kind of almost take a layer approach, right? Of course, you want to do the security by design. You want to eliminate all the low hanging fruit, make sure all the API, the no authenticating API. But at the same time, in the worst case, maybe detect and respond and respond to incidents like that. Yeah,
that's what we call a customer with a high risk appetite.
Exactly.
Yes, as someone who'd rather pay for that bug bounty researcher to find those, demonstrate through 10 records rather than writing that blog post starting, "We take your security seriously." Lebin, one of the things we do take seriously around here is fun questions for our guests. Hopefully you've had some fun already with, talking about API and the state of API security. One of the things we're doing this year is asking each of our guests to complete a phrase for us. This is where we're putting together an AppSec yearbook, if you will. And the phrase is, AppSec is most likely to what? How would you complete that sentence?
So I will have a kind of, I hope it's a little unusual answer, is I would say AppSec in 2024 is very likely to go to two extremes. You're either going to have an extremely bad year where you have extremely bad incidents, or actually you see a very, very promising progress where something you can be proud of. For example, AppSec team is implementing innovative approach. The reason I'm saying this is because the customer awareness is are there. And I'm seeing actually a increasing collaboration between developers and security teams. And they also pushing vendors like us to introduce innovation to help them automate, and actually there's a very promising technology like AI and like machine learning. And I'm not talking about like extremely sophisticated AI that can, read the mind of developers, but just very simple, techniques that can help automate, help make the life easier. Then maybe we can, see that quantum leap start happening. Or if, the bad actors become, use the tool more sophisticated, because the sophisticated tool, the AI tools and all that will be also available for the bad actors, right? So it's arms race. So, my prediction is we will go too extreme. It will not be a year of no news is good news.
We'll check back in at the end of December just to see how optimistic or pessimistic we could be here. Yes, but I do just real quick. I do like that point about the distinction between ML as it was used for categorization, classification, identifying outliers, as it's been for probably the last 5 to 10 years, I think, amongst many security tools, versus the LLMs and jazz hands, as we like to do here, of artificial intelligence and whatever magic that might or maybe not bring. But in any case, just some fun discussions here, Lebin. Hopefully, you've encouraged listeners out there to go and look for, revisit some of those deprecated endpoints, make sure they have authentication, and go shine some light on those shadow APIs. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. It's always fun talking to you guys.
Thank you again, Lebin. Yes, well, hopefully it won't be 2 more years before we hear more about some APIs. I want to thank Akira and John as well. Thank all of our listeners. To learn more about Imperva, visit securityweekly.com/Imperva. And with that, we're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.